the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California and Nevada. And it's my pleasure today to talk to you about the Endangered Species Act with a focus on species in California. So I have a lot of California species on my slides. I'm not going to specifically go through each one, but I'm hoping that you'll just enjoy some of the California species that are on the federal endangered species list. Okay, so why the Endangered Species Act? So how did this come to be? So the 1960s saw an increase in global awareness about the loss of species and their habitats. And this led to the 1966 passage of the Endangered Species Preservation Act. So this was the initial piece of legislation. It was pretty narrow in scope, but it was a good start. In 1967, so a year later, the Department of Interior published the first endangered species list. So this had 78 species of birds, fish, mammals, and amphibians, no plants yet. We weren't quite there. And then in 1973, so 51 years ago, the Endangered Species Act, which greatly expanded on that Endangered Species Preservation Act, it was signed into law by President Nixon. So this is how the 1973 Act begins. And I know this seems crazy, but I'm going to read it to you all because it's that good. Okay, the Congress finds and declares that various species of fish, wildlife, and plants in the United States have been rendered extinct as a consequence of economic growth and development untempered by adequate concern and conservation. Other species of fish, wildlife, and plants have been so depleted in numbers that they are in danger of or threatened with extinction. These species of fish, wildlife, and plants are of aesthetic, ecological, educational, historical, recreational, and scientific value to the nation and its people. The purposes of this act are to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered and threatened species depend may be conserved. Like, this is extraordinary. This is visionary. This is forward thinking. I mean, right here in a nutshell, it tells you exactly what the Endangered Species Act is about. And so in terms of the Act's purpose and goals, that acknowledgement of the inherent value of wildlife and the ecosystems upon which they depend, I mean, that's there. That's how it starts. So it's got some other things in it. And it has definitions of what endangered and threatened means. And it lays out a framework and process for us to list species as endangered and threatened. It then identifies prohibited actions for species that are on the list. So these are things that become illegal or unlawful for species on the act. So you can't harass, harm, kill, trap, or collect species that are on the list. That becomes illegal. And the idea is if you prohibit those things, you're protecting the species that are on that decline towards extinction, and hopefully they'll start to do better. The Act directs funding to states for conservation. So this is a big one. This is federal funds that go to state wildlife agencies to do good things for listed species. So this is like habitat protection, land acquisition, conservation easements, habitat restoration, monitoring, research. So this funding can fund all of those things for listed species. The Act also tasks federal agencies with helping to fulfill the purposes of the Act, and it directs the development of recovery plans where we figure out the thresholds at which point a species should no longer need protections of the Act. So like, how many individuals do you need? How many populations do you need? What threat levels do you need such that the species is recovered? So there have been some amendments to the Endangered Species Act since it was passed in 1973. In 1978, distinct population segments for vertebrates were added. So when the Act was passed in 1973, species and subspecies could be put on the list. And in 1978, they added distinct population segments. In 1982, deadlines for listing findings were added, additional options for experimental populations, and incidental take permits for listed species in connection with otherwise lawful activities. That's a mouthful. Those are habitat conservation plans. If you're familiar with those, we have many of them in California. Those were added. In 1988, post-delisting monitoring was added. So that's a provision that we have to monitor species for 5 years at least. Exemptions for military lands from critical habitat when a management plan is in place was added. So these are just a few, but the point is people have been tinkering with it. No big changes, but they've been tinkering with it over time. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is in the Department of the Interior, and the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is in NOAA, have the primary responsibility for carrying out implementation of the Endangered Species Act. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is who I work for, we have responsibility over species found in freshwater and on land. And then the National Marine Fisheries Service has responsibility for species found primarily in marine habitats. So this also includes salmonids. The Fish and Wildlife Service, we have jurisdiction over the vast majority of listed species with over 1,300 listed species nationwide. And National Marine Fisheries Service, they have a jurisdiction over about 165 species. So, but that's a lot of species on the endangered species list in general. Okay, so at the risk of boring you all with the flow chart, I'm very concerned about this, but I'm going to go for it anyway. I wanted to give you a sense of the process that we go through to figure out whether or not a species needs to go on the list. And so on the left-hand side, you can't see it because it's underneath the recording bar up there, but there is a process for the service to go through our discretionary evaluation of whether or not a species needs to go on the list. And then on the right-hand side, it says receive petition. And so that's the petition process driven by the public. And since that's how the majority of our listing assessments start, I'm going to go there. Okay, so a petition is a science-backed request from the public to add a species to the list. So the vast majority of these come to us from environmental advocacy organizations, but some come from experts at universities, other NGOs. We get petitions from the general public. And so the first thing we do when it comes into us is called a 90-day finding. And so that's from that 1982 amendment to the act that put in timelines for listing. So a 90-day finding is really up to low bar. We're basically looking to see if the petition contains substantial information, that's the term, that we think the action may be warranted. So if the petition does not contain substantial information, then we would do the not substantial 90-day finding. That's the final agency action on the petition. If the petition does contain substantial information, which they usually do, then we make a substantial finding. So for species for which we make a substantial finding, we then put them on our national listing, or I'll also put the link to the most recent plan there. So the national listing work plan, it lays out the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listing workload. This most recent one, it goes out to 2027. There's about 350 species on it across the country that are all waiting there. We've done a substantial 90-day finding and they're waiting there for us to evaluate them for listing. So once our species of interest comes up on that national listing work plan, we then initiate our species status assessment, or SSA. And so that's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service framework where we evaluate threats and conservation actions affecting a species response to those influences. It's a risk assessment for the species and undergoes formal peer review. And that SSA, it's the scientific foundation for our Endangered Species Act decision-making. So we take that SSA into a recommendation team meeting. That's where our decision makers, they overlay policy definitions onto that science. Oops, sorry. And they make a decision about whether or not a species warrants listing. So there's 3 potential 12-month finding outcomes of that recommendation team meeting. One is warranted but precluded. So this is when we find, yeah, the species warrants listing, but actually following through with that is precluded by higher priority actions related to the National Listing Work Plan. This puts the species on a candidate list. It starts into this annual candidate notice of review. So in the recent history, we really haven't been making warranted but precluded findings. However, in 2020, we did make kind of a high profile one for the monarch butterfly. It's now up on the National Listing Work Plan for us to make a real decision on it this year. So look for that in December. So another outcome, one of our other 3 outcomes of the recommendation team meeting, is that the species is not found to meet the definition of either endangered or threatened as defined in the Endangered Species Act. So we say, no, it doesn't meet those definitions. If that's the case, we publish that finding in the Federal Register. That's our final agency action on the petition. And then the third possibility is that the species is found to meet the definition of threatened or endangered, again, as defined in the Act. If this is the case, we publish a proposed rule to list the species. This opens a 60-day public comment period. We then assess any new information that comes in during this comment period. And if the new information suggests, yes, it is true, we still think that the species meets the definition of threatened or endangered, then we would issue a final rule. If we get new information that says, oops, we got it wrong, it doesn't actually meet the definition of threatened or endangered, we can withdraw the proposed rule. So if we issue that final rule, we say, yes, it does meet the definition of threatened or endangered, then the species name goes on the federal list of threatened and endangered species, usually 30 days afterwards. And that's when the protections of the Act actually start for the species. So it's a pretty solid process to get to actually getting the name on the endangered species list. Okay, so about 300 species that occur in California have been placed on the list of federal threatened and endangered species. What we've got here on this bar chart is number of species on our vertical axis. Down here on the bottom, on the horizontal axis, we have time. So pre-1973 is there at the bottom, so that would be the Endangered Species Preservation Act species. And then we've got the administration since the act was passed. So we've got Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. And the colors are loose taxonomic groups: amphibians, birds, fish, mammals, reptiles, invertebrates, and plants. So I did not expect this when I made this graph. So there's clearly a pattern that is shocking and comes out immediately. And that is what was going on in the 90s with all these plants under the Clinton administration. And so I did some digging. And the answer is it's the result of a California Native Plant Society lawsuit and a list of candidate plant species provided to the service by the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian had given the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service this long list of plants. They said, we think these are at risk. We think you should evaluate them for listing. This was early in the Act's history. And we put them on the candidate list and we mostly just left them there. California Native Plant Society, they sued us. And they said, you need to evaluate whether or not these plants on this list that occur in California really warrant listing. And we did. And we found that over 100 of them belonged on the endangered species list. So this is amazing and shocking and interesting to learn, but it was clearly washing out any other kind of pattern that we would see. So I took the plants off, and here's just the animals. So there are 115 animal species that occur in California that have been placed on, again, on the list of federal threatened and endangered species. So there was still a lot of listing that was happening in the 90s. So we've still got the most under Clinton, but the second most was under Reagan, in terms of what was added after the 1973 Act was passed. And then you can see that kind of how we have like this lower level of listing that's bobbling around. In more recent history, 2 animal species were put on the endangered species list under Trump. Again, these have different times, right? Some of these are 4 years and some of them are 8 years. So it's not a perfect comparison, but I think it's really interesting. And I mean, there's a lot of things driving these patterns. Clearly, lawsuits are a big driver of these patterns. But you know, the Endangered Species Act, it's a piece of legislation It's implemented by the executive branch of the federal government. It's inherently political. So there's politics going on here too. Okay, so we've had 50 years, actually 51 years, as Brad pointed out, of endangered species conservation in California. What do we have to show for it? So the last free-flying California condors were brought into captivity to save the species from extinction when they were listed. And now we have a couple of hundred free-flying condors out there. They're certainly not recovered, but they're doing a lot better and they're on their way. After banning the use of DDT, brown pelicans began to recover and they were delisted in 2009. That's super cool. 8 species on California's Channel Islands have been delisted due to recovery. Some of these are plants. I think Scott's going to talk to us about some of this success. The Nature Conservancy has been an incredible partner on California's Channel Islands. National wildlife refuges, which are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they were established to help conserve endangered and threatened species. And the Cooperative Endangered Species Conservation Fund, which is again that federal money that's given to states as part of the Endangered Species Act, it's led to the conservation of hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat in California for listed species. And that's pretty incredible. A little bit of by the numbers, 19 California species have been delisted due to recovery. Only 2 California listed species have been lost to extinction. So the goal of the Endangered Species Act is definitely to get species off the list, to recover them, right? So you've got the species, it's at risk, it's heading towards extinction. We put it on the list, puts some protections into place, mobilizes resources, gets public interest involvement, gets academics involved in research. You know, it does all these things. We hope that it turns the trajectory of the species around, it starts doing better, and we take it off the list. That's the goal. But there's definitely a level of extinction prevention that's at play as well. And we put a species on the list, it's not doing well. It sort of stabilizes, but it's only doing it takes a long time for a lot of these species to have them really turn their trajectory around. And for some species, maybe that's not even possible. So again, there's an extinction prevention piece of this. And overall, nationwide, the Endangered Species Act has saved 99% of listed species from extinction. So that's saying something. So these successes, both recovery and extinction prevention, they face increasing challenges as we look into the future. In California, we have increasing temperatures, invasive species, novel diseases, altered fire regimes, megafire, sea level rise, you know, and that's just a short list. And given these challenges, it's more important than ever that we use all the tools in the conservation toolbox. The Endangered Species Act is one tool. It's a powerful tool, but it's just one, but we should use it, and we should use it well among the other tools that we have in the toolbox. In 1973, Congress acknowledged the inherent value of native wildlife plants and their ecosystems upon which they depend. That's the language in the act. You know, species diversity is valuable. We should continue the work to try to conserve it. Thanks, appreciate it. Look forward to continuing the conversation.